My name is Sarah, and I'm the Adult Services Librarian here in Ireland, and we are very honored Robert Black with us tonight. He's part of the Oregon Area Historical Society, and he knows his stuff. And so we get to learn all about Wisconsin POW camps. How many of you knew those even existed? All right, got some hands up, put some hands down too. So, Robert, thank you so much for being here. I'm gonna hand it to you.
Well, thank you. And welcome to tonight's presentation. Before we get started on POW, let me just introduce to you a couple of new presentations that I have that you might find interesting. The first one is called Camp Randall Civil War on Wisconsin. If you're from Wisconsin, you know time you mentioned the word Camp Randall. We're talking about that iconic football stadium, Madison, home of the UW Badgers. And what this presentation will tell you is the story of Camp Randall, going all the way back to 1861. Around Union soldiers getting ready to march off the Civil War. And following the Civil War, that land was deeded to the University of Wisconsin to be used as an athletic facility. And they'll play their first football game here in 1895. And in 1917, they will build for the very first foundation of the stadium that we know today as Camp Randall. It's a really fun presentation. Badger songs like "I'm in Wisconsin," and "You Said It All." So it's a fun one to do. Another one that I think you'll find very interesting is titled "Forensic Science Wisconsin Crime Laboratory." If you've watched CSI, you know that they will process a crime scene, analyze the evidence, and convict somebody in a court of law all in 1 hour. And we know that's not reality. So in this presentation, I will tell you the reality of forensic science. Find forensic science for you. I'll tell you of the forensic services provided by the CSI. We'll go to some crime scenes and I'll tell you what evidence was collected, who was charged, and what ultimately happened to those individuals. And that was all based on years as a forensic analyst with the crime laboratory in Madison, Wisconsin. It's one that I think people, because of their curiosity of CSI, find to be very interesting. So let's begin tonight's presentation. And I'm going to start, first of all, by talking about U.S. POW. And I'm going to introduce, at the beginning of the presentation, 5 questions. And those are, why did the POWs come to the U.S.? Where did they come from? How did they get here? Where did they go once they arrived? And what happened to them after the war? And then we'll transition into Wisconsin POW camps. Most people, many of you know or knew something about POW camps, but most people are not aware of the fact that Wisconsin had. They're very surprised to find out that they actually had 39 of them, housing up to 20,000 POWs. And so we'll talk a little bit about some of those specific POW camps in Wisconsin. But the question that I often get asked is, how did you get interested in POW? Let's start by answering that question. And it all began with this wooden crate. And you say, how could a wooden crate get you interested in POWs? Well, this crate has a story of its own. So let's begin here. I found this crate at a garage sale in Oregon, Wisconsin. And I like old wooden crates. This was around for a while, it was a little beat up, but it was in relatively good condition and good shape. And cleaning, I noticed a leather patch on one end of that crate. Plus lettering bulged under this leather pouch. And so I thought, well, is there really something under there or not? So I removed a couple of the nails and looked underneath. And sure enough, there was a small closed manila envelope that said happiness. I thought, well, what's inside of there? So when I looked in there, indeed, there was a sheet of yellow paper, not beige yellow, but colored yellow. And it looked to be in pristine condition. It wasn't crumbly, it wasn't smeared. For inspection, I noticed in the upper right-hand corner of the date, 1/24, that crate. It said that crate was somewhere around 80 years old. Fourth Army's camps with Texas. And that, looking a little bit further, that it went to the United States Armed Forces Institute, Madison, Wisconsin. Madison, Hamilton is between the university and 74, about the end of the year. If I looked at what that listing on that sheet of paper, this would appear to be training material that the officers who were doing the training, and they were training the area at the end of World War II and transition. It turns out that there actually was a second envelope under that leather patch, and multiple pages of material that had been contained in that wooden crate. It's not unusual to find an artifact at a garage sale. And an artifact is defined as anything made by a human being. Artifact. What is unusual is to find an artifact that actually has attached document, gives you the history of that artifact. So we know that this wooden crate came from Camp Swift. We know it went to the Army Institute in Madison, and we know what it contained. And we know that when this happened in 1946. So this crate indeed is a treasured, valuable artifact. Currently, it sits in my family room. I'm using it as a coffee table, and it'll probably remain there. Now, while I was able to learn quite a bit about this crate from the documentation, where has this crate been for 78, 80 years? We know where it came from, we know where it went, but where it had been since that time. Who had this box and what did they use it for? Again, we know the military had it, but then how did he use it after that? How did it end up in a garage sale in Oregon, Wisconsin? And then lastly, the packing list was present or not. I find it hard to believe that the packing list remained intact in that 80 years and nobody else took the time to see if there was anything there or not. Well, in my research of this crate, I wanted to know a little bit about Camp Swift. And this is what Camp Swift looked like in 1940. Built in Bastrop, Texas, which is just outside of Austin, Texas. It was built in 1941 on 56,000 acres of land and had 2,800 buildings. It was built in 120 days at a cost of $25 million. And it was opened in May of 1942. It will house up to 90,000 GIs, making it one of the largest training and camps in Texas. for those preparing for World War II. And it will train up to 300,000 soldiers at this today, but it's only about 1/5 of its original size. Today, it is the National Arms Training Center and the Texas National Guard Training Center. What got me interested in POWs was during World War II, this camp held up to 10,000 German POWs. Well, Camp Swift had POWs. What about Camp McCoy here in Wisconsin? I had to look into that, and sure enough, Camp McCoy also had POWs. But when we talk about war, we have to talk about the consequences of war. Destruction, death, and POWs. If we consider the home, the industry, destroyed England, Europe, Russia, Japan, that would come to trillions and trillions of dollars. I think the estimate that I saw in today's dollars would be somewhere around $17 trillion. Yes. And as well as POWs. When we talk about death, World War II ran from September of 1939 to September of 1945. And we will never know the true number of deaths that occurred during war. There are only estimates. And it is estimated that there were 21 to 25 million, 50 to 55 million civilian deaths, 5 to 6 million Holocaust deaths, for a total of 70 to 85 million people perished during World War II. And this would represent about 3% of the world's population at that time, for some billion people. And during this time, Germany will have if you were a Russian, you did not want to be in a German POW camp. There'll be some 6 million Russian POWs. 3 million will not survive captivity. They will die from starvation, exposure, illness, forced labor, and death marches. But likewise, if you're a German, you do not want to be in a Russian POW camp. There'll be some 3 million German POWs, 1 million will not survive captivity, and they will die from causes. If you are a German POW in a Russian POW camp, you will be sentenced to 25 years of hard labor. And you will see then that German POWs will then be released in 1950. The last of them are released in 1956. If you were an American, you did not want to be in a Japanese POW camp. There'll be some 27,000 American POWs, and 40% of them, or 10,800, will not survive captivity. And again, they will die from many of the Japanese are even more vicious with their POWs than were the German and the Russian. We all know how bad they were. Battlefield conduct, which says you will fight to the death. And not only do they hold that expectation for themselves, from that hard labor, you are not worth anything at all when you are eliminated. All of these countries and nations will have death marches at the end of the war, or as we approach the end of the war. Perhaps the most infamous or famous march is the Bataan Death March. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th of 1941. The next day, on December 8th, they will attack the Philippines. But unlike Pearl Harbor, they will follow this with a land assault and a blockade around the island. The Americans will fight fiercely with the Japanese. The Japanese will eventually back up the Allied forces to the southern tip of the Bataan Peninsula. The Americans will fight until they've run out of ammunition and food, and they've reached the point of starvation, and the Japanese will capture 75,000 Allied troops. They will then make them march 65 miles, put them in boxcars where there is no place to sit. They can only stand, and many will die from suffocation and from disease. 1,000 Philippine troops will not survive that death march. So they were very vicious with their POWs. Interesting statistics. These are the number of W's from World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam. 42,227 American POWs. Of that, 1,929 were Wisconsinites, and of those, 15,190 died in captivity. The interesting number here is that of those 15,000, 3/4 of them will die at the hands of the Japanese. As I mentioned, they were very, very vicious with their POWs and with their civilians in. The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th of 1941. And on December 8th, then the U.S. will declare war against Japan. The U.S. will declare war against Germany on December 11th of 1941, following Hitler's declaration of war against the U.S. The U.S. country that Hitler declares war against. Britain was taking all POWs from the European front. They are running out of room. So after the U.S. has declared war against Japan, we agree that beginning in early 1942, we will take all POWs, regardless of where they come from, whether it be the European front, whether it be Japan or Africa. With our military and our return the injured and the POWs. Right? They would go to one of 511 area camps or 175 branch camps. They would use the conservation corps camps and military bases. And the reason they would use these is because they already had infrastructure, the barracks and the security. Initially, the thought was to establish these camps overseas, eliminating the need to transport them. Materials to establish and build these camps, and not just the barracks, but the infrastructure, the roads, plumbing, the electrical. And that was going to be very costly. But an even greater cost was if we were to build these overseas, at these camps, and we sorely needed those military forces on the battlefront. So therefore, the decision was made to bring them here to the U.S. Take care of things like escapes, rebellions, and so forth, which could be more easily controlled here than they could overseas. Here, those camps being attacked by the enemy in an effort to release those. Have some escape attempts. In fact, we'll have a total of 2,287 escapes. All of those will be caught within a relatively short time. In many cases, less than 24 hours. Some will go longer. Some will eventually actually escape But eventually they will either all be caught or they'll turn themselves in. The government will try to just inkling of civilians and POWs for a number of reasons, and we will mention some of those as we go through. You're going to find out as we go through the presentation, they didn't necessarily do a really good job preventing that intermingling. When we talk about the escapes, in another presentation that I do, following the war, all of the POWs had been captured or returned, except for 12. And the FBI will go searching for those 12. And eventually they will get them all. They're either captured. And one makes it to Mexico, one makes it back to Germany, and one died for 40 years before he turns himself in. The last of Hitler's soldiers to surrender 40 years following the war. If you like being interested in that series, and that's a 4-part series with the untold, unheard, untold. Greatest that I call it the Great Arizona Escape. And this happened at Camp POW Park in Phoenix, or outside of Phoenix. And this is where they would do the desert training of POWs here, including a large batch of sailors. And I thought how appropriate that they took these men who spent their life on the water and sent them to a desert POW. Quite appropriate. They didn't have work at this POW camp with POWs like we did here in Wisconsin. And so the POWs asked if they could have tools, give them some form of recreation. And the camp commander thought, well, you know, if they're busy building this field and they're playing volleyball, they're not problems. So he gives them the tools. And they put those tools to very good use. On the 23rd of 1944, 25 of these POWs will escape through a 178-foot tunnel. The mission was to hike 30 miles to the Gila River, float their canoe down to the Colorado River, and then from there down to the Mexican border. The only problem was that they forgot they were at the Gila River, there was no water. So they went off into the desert. A number of them realized the harsh conditions they were going to be in. The others were eventually captured, although 2 of them did get within 10 miles of the Mexican border. On the left is the escape tunnel. It will drop down 6 feet and then travel 178 feet underground. On the right is the newspaper article the next day telling about this great escape. These are the 19 that are still missing that they haven't captured. Eventually they will capture. For their capture is $25. Not too long ago, there were 7 that escaped from jail in Louisiana, and the capture reward is kind of taken that control of that. That they have even existed in many places. Right here is the marker where the escape Camp POW Park. Camp POW Park still exists today. It's just a few administrative buildings. On the left, plaque for Camp Reedsburg, and tells a little bit about the World War II POW camp. I have a neighbor who lives down the street. Never knew they had a POW camp in her hometown. California will have the most with 110. Texas is next with 80. Wisconsin will have 39. If we look at a map of the US, you can see how these camps are scattered throughout the country. They tend to be concentrated to the south because it's less costly to put up a tent encampment than to put up wooden barracks, are less expensive to keep those camps than in the north. If we take all of the area camps, branch camps, and military facilities, there are 1,000 locations housing POWs. The U.S. will take a total of in excess of 425,000 POWs, consisting mostly of Germans, Italians, and Japanese, but there'll be other nationalities as well, like Korean, Russian, and so forth. Activity or as well as POW. In the U.S., of that 425,000, we only have 477 POWs died. But they died from 265 natural causes, 72 suicides, 43 traffic accidents, 17 drownings. 14 POWs found guilty of murder, and that is murder of another POW. Charged and found guilty and hung. I initially thought that there were no POWs killed by the military, but upon further research, I found that there were a total of 56 POWs killed either by the military or civilians, generally in an effort to escape. Again, if you come to that unusual story presentation, up into a guard tower at midnight and start firing the machine gun POW tents, killing something in POWs. He was court-martialed. Well, the information I'm going to share with you on the POW camps comes from this book, Stalag, Wisconsin. It was written by Betty Colley. Betty Colley was a history teacher in Altoona, Wisconsin, suburb of Eau Claire. And her students would not believe her when she told them that Altoona once housed POW. Upon her retirement, she began her research to write her book, and research was difficult to come by. Camps in the National Archives were destroyed in the 1950s. Stories about World War II and POWs and POW camps were censored in many papers. But she'd do her research, and in addition to that, she would talk to over 300 people that either were a POW, worked with a POW, or lived in a community that had a POW camp. First POW camp was Camp McCoy. This was a POW camp within Fort McCoy. The Camp POW would be a 20-acre site surrounded by a double 8-foot chain link fence. It will have guard towers and guard dogs. It will have 30 to 35 buildings consisting of barracks, kitchen, mess hall, laundry, bathroom facilities. The POWs will do their own cooking, maintenance of the mess hall, their ground, their barracks. They'll even do their own laundry. So the camps self-sufficient. This is a rendering of what Camp McCoy looked like, drawn by a German POW in 1943. I did some training at Camp McCoy with law enforcement, and this is a pretty good rendering of what the camp looks like. And other than a few more modern buildings, it still looks pretty much like this. Barracks are still there, and they're still used by primarily law enforcement, but military as well. First POWs will arrive at Camp McCoy in 1942. The camp already exists prior to this, and it is serving as an internment camp. Germans, Japanese, or Italians thought to be a threat to the government. You're probably well aware of the internment camps of the Japanese that were interned in California and Western and Southern states, where they interned 120,000 Japanese, many of them U.S. citizens. But in early 1940s, camp will stay open and operate till June of 1946. And at one point, it will have as many as 5,000 German POWs, 3,500 Japanese POWs, and 500 Korean POWs. If you're like me, you might say, where did these Koreans come from? And we'll get to that in just a second. I just want to tell you a story about Ensign Sakamaki. He is one of 10 Japanese naval officers harbor in 5 two-man mini subs. I'm not going to go into all the details of his sub in another presentation called. Literally, he is spotted by a USS Helm, who began to fire at its conning tower and set off depth charges, literally blowing his sub out of the water onto a coral reef. He will attempt to destroy his submarine with explosives. They fail to go off. His crewmate will be carried out to sea and he will drown. 9 of those 10 naval officers will be killed. The next morning on December 8th, a soldier on beach patrol will find an unconscious Sakamaki laying on the beach, and he will capture Sakamaki, and Sakamaki will become U.S. POW number 1. He will then be sent to the U.S. He will arrive at Camp McCoy on March 9th of 1942, and he will remain a POW for the duration of the war. Years old when he enters Pearl Harbor in his effort to attack, he will fight in the war for 1 day. He will spend the rest of the war as a POW. And that these POWs at Camp McCoy tend to be resistant and territorial. That is, the Germans will stay together as a group, as will the Japanese, as will the Koreans, and they will not get along with each other. But even within nationalities, they will not get along. So the Nazis do not get along with the non-Nazis. The non-Nazis are not party members, but they have been conscripted into the military to fight the war. The Nazis will intimidate, harass, and even kill the non-Nazis. Japanese POWs are dedicated to the emperor. The Army will blame the Navy for not doing a sufficient job of blockading the island, keeping the American Allied forces from attacking. Navy POWs and Army, so they tend to control the camp. Here's where the Koreans come in. Part 2 started in September of 1939. Japan is what is called the Japanese Sino War, or Japanese-Chinese War. Japan is expanding their empire. And in order to fight a war, they need raw materials like coal, iron ore, oil. And their source for this is primarily China. And they've already started this war against China in 1937. But they've also attacked other Southern Pacific nations, such as Korea. And they conquered these nations, and they have forced them to fight the war for the Japanese. So this is why we will have escapes from Camp McCoy. 14 Japanese and 4 Germans will escape, but they'll be caught in a relatively short time. It's kind of hopeless and useless to attempt to escape. They don't know the language. They don't have any means of transportation. They have no money. They don't know the contour. And they wear prison garb with a big letter PW on the front and the back. going to be quite obvious that they don't belong where they are other than in camp. The POWs, it will be the German POWs that will go and work at these various camps. The Japanese are never allowed to leave Camp McCoy to work. And the reason for that is because of their code of conduct, which says they will fight to the death. There is so much fear and concern about what they might do if they were able to escape, that they are never allowed to leave the camp. It doesn't mean they didn't have work to do. They would have work, but it would be all within Camp McCoy. And their return to their home country. One German POW, when asked, given an opportunity to escape, would you? And he said, why would I do so? He said, if I'd known the conditions we were going to have in captivity, he said, such as beds with blankets, pillows, and furs, I would have surrendered a whole lot sooner versus fighting till we ran out of ammunition and sleeping on the top of our tanks. They knew they had it good. They had housing, they had food, they had life was not bad for many of these POWs. And you'll find out later that many of them didn't want to go back home following the war. Branch camps that were in Wisconsin, and they range from Antigo to Hortonville and Janesville to Wisconsin Rapids. I'll come back to this at the end so that you can see whether you may have lived, grown up, or worked in. Here you can see a map of how these camps were scattered throughout the state. 15 of these camps were opened in June of 1944. The last camp to open is Camp Ashland, which opened. The smallest POW camp will be Camp Bayfield, 125 POWs. The two largest branch camps will be Camp Billy Mitchell, 1,000 POWs, and Camp Surgeon Bay with 2,100 POWs. The two shortest operated camps will be Camp Jefferson and Camp Lake Kesis. They're only open for 1 month, June to July of 1944. Run camps are Camp Hartford and Camp Rockfield, which will run for 12 and 18 consecutive months. We could, but we would follow the 1929 Geneva Convention and the Red work-related labor, and you could not force POW officers to work. And if they did work, they had to be compensated, and they would be compensated at 80 cents a day. In addition to this, they would receive 10 cents a day in gratuity pay. That money would be collected and accumulated, and at the end of the war, they'd be given that in the form of cash to take with them when they return home. Businesses that would wage. So as an example, if they're getting 80 cents a day and they are working for 12 hours, that would be $9.80. They would get the 80 cents. The government would get the $9. And based on that, the government will earn a total of somewhere around $360 million for POW labor, more than half the cost of the war. Crops. I'm not a big vegetable eater, and I didn't know we grew all these vegetable crops in Wisconsin, but they would be harvesting all of these different crops or planting them. They'd be picking at orchards. They would do lumbering, dairies, farming, canneries, industrial factories, tanneries. Pretty much anywhere where there was a shortage of labor, you may have found POW working. And yet again, there'll be hundreds of thousands of US citizens that will never even know that we had. Where would we find them housed? We find them on fairgrounds and buildings, tent camps, farms, cannery property, military bases, and government buildings. So here's Camp Mayfield, which was the county courthouse and community building. The POWs will sleep on the gym floor in the upper level. They will have their kitchen and mess hall on the main floor. They will take their showers in the basement. Guard stations out front and a picket fence across the back of the building to keep civilians out. On the upper left is Camp Reedsburg, which is an example of a tent encampment. On the bottom is Camp Plymouth, which was at the fairground. POWs would be in this housed in the wooden building. The tent will serve as their kitchen and mess hall. Now, double fence, guard towers, guard dog, because of those Japanese POWs and the fear that they may attempt to escape. While some of the branch camps will have fairly good security with fence and even guard towers, some won't have anything at all. Parts. An example, Camp Reedsburg had no fencing or security whatsoever until the local editor of the paper wrote an editorial. Camp commander made sure he'd make this camp secure, and he surrounded the campgrounds with a picket fence. Now, the purpose of the picket fence was not to prevent POWs from escaping. The purpose of the picket fence was to keep the civilians out of the camp. That will become a problem at many of the POW camps, not just in Wisconsin, but throughout the nation. Here is Camp Rockfield. Now, this would be a guard station versus a guard tower, like you saw at Camp Boy. It actually had its banner. And again, this was a tent encampment. And this is the one that will run the longest continuously for 18 months. Here's Camp Hartford. And this was at the Swartz Ballroom in Hartford. And this is where the big bands would come and perform, like Lawrence Welk and Benny Goodman and others. This camp will be year round, as is Rockfield, because other than seasonal work, they have work for them year round, such as dairy farm, milk and cheese processing plant, manufacturing, and so forth. They will harvest hemp here for rope, as do many of the camps. There's still wild hemp that grows out in the field, and actually is now legal to grow hemp in the state of Wisconsin. I'm right when I'll give you a whole story about that, but I won't get into it today. Interesting story here. There was a farmer who would come and pick up the food waste and take it back to the farm and feed it to his pigs. He would then go to the camp commander and complain about the amount of food being wasted. So the camp commander took care of that problem. He went out and bought 10 little piglets and brought them back to the camp to feed them the waste food. And when they got big, he will feed them to the POW. In 1945, this camp made $250,182 for the government on labor. Following the war, the big bands will never come back to the sports ballroom again. Well, let me just run through some other camps. Here's some quick stories for you. Camp Antigo. Many of the POWs would work at a farm, and they may have a lunch break, and the farm family would give them corn to eat, and they would eat. Until that one, they will actually butter and salt this and give it to the German POWs. They'll eat it, they'll like it, and they'll ask for some of that dried corn seed. here in Wisconsin. And anytime we'd have a meal with corn, he refused to eat it because he said that is what we used to fat pigs. So apparently, hereditary wise, that was brought over with the Germans. There was a woman who said she was actually a child in Germany during World War II. And she said, indeed, we would not eat the corn because it was not like American corn. It was hard, dry, and you would not want to try and chew and eat it. And she refused to eat it here until her husband finally convinced her to try it once. And she said she didn't realize how soft and sweet it was. And she said she now will eat corn. I'll come back to that. Camp Cobb. There was a German barber who would give free haircuts to the POWs and the military guards. He was losing business and money. So the guards could no longer get, barber didn't make any money either. 14-year-old here working in a hemp field. A POW approaches him and said, why aren't you in the military fighting the war? He said, well, I'm only 14. And the POW said, well, I'm 16. I saw the POWs range in age in 1365. Germany at that point. In Fond du Lac, they arrive by rail. They go to the fairgrounds and our military liked beer, but so do those Germans. And they could buy it in the camp canteen. And he'd show up every other day after that, bringing more beer. There's a story here. I'm sure this happened in more locations than just Camp Fond du Lac, but it's the only one where they reported an American woman becomes pregnant by no. U.S. citizens were not allowed to marry Germans. Good after he went home and then got a visa and came back. Married them while they were POWs. Camp Oxley. Here the POWs would get matches to light their cigarettes and their pipes, and they would begin to collect these match heads and put them into a large metal box until they get the box stuck. One night they'll sneak out and put this box on a gill, light a fuse, and stand outside their tents. This box will go off with a loud explosion, and the guards panic and grab their rifles and start firing and shooting while the POWs are standing there laughing hilariously. Well, they're punished and they receive half rations for a week. But that doesn't stop POWs. One day they're out cutting down trees and then they're chopping up the branches and they realize that the branch had fallen and killed a skunk. So they take the skunk and they bury this. When they grab their shovels and start digging and find the skunk. Rations as punishment for the week. But the guards get their revenge. The Germans like to comb and groom their hair, and they didn't have the hair creams and stuff at the POW camps like they did back home. And one of the Germans said, well, you know, back home their hair creams have birch. And they extract some of the sap, they put it in their hair, worked really well for in their hair until it dried. And it'll look like a helmet on their head. And so the the guards would then take and shave all of their head. Camp Fredonia. This is a new culture for the German POW. Which is different, the land is different. And some of these new foods they would try that they've never had before, like Jello, which they like, and German potato salad. I'm assuming they had potato salad, but maybe they just didn't call it German. And one of their favorite desserts was apple pie. So again, would have thought was international, but apparently. man. He's one of 87 of his manages to escape down to 60 pounds. Brought back to the US and he goes to a military hospital in Chicago. He's given a leave of absence and he goes to his hometown of Galesville. First couple of nights he spends at home recovering. And then one night he decides to go out to his old hangout called the Coffee Cup. When he walks in, he's astonished to see the beard. And even more so, the guards joining them with their rifles leaning against the wall. He's furious. He rushes home. He grabs his Winchester rifle, heads back to the coffee cup, orders out all the civilians, lines up the POWs and the guard, and marches them back to the camp. The camp commander gets things settled finally. Sergeant Cram will get back to Chicago to continue his recovery, but thereafter, no POWs will ever be allowed in downtown Galesville. Camp Green Lake. There's a German couple in Milwaukee. They own the Deutschland Dairy. The mother decides to take the 16-year-old son to Germany to visit with the grandparents. When they get to Germany, Germans confiscate the 16-year-old's passport and they draft him into the military. He becomes a paratrooper. He will jump into the war over Greece and shortly thereafter surrender to the Allied forces. He will be sent back to the US. He will end up at Camp Green Lake. He tries to that he's a US citizen and they tend to believe that he is, but they still treat him as a POW, using him as an interpreter for the military and the POW. Following the war, they do not release him. They repatriate him back to Germany, where he now has to apply for a visa, which he does, and eventually he will come back to the US. And we don't know whether these people are actually citizens. We don't know what their status is, and so they would be treated as POWs. Camp Green Lake was at the Lawson Farm, and you might know it today as the Lawson adult course. Camp Hortonville, they have a sauerkraut factory at $12 million addition to this plant and establishing their corporate headquarters in Madison. Here, there was a 17-year-old who subs for his father, driving a school bus, picking up the POWs, and taking it. When they pick up the POWs, they all get on the bus, followed by a single military guard. Front by the driver, and the 17-year-old was a little worried about the POW having a rifle until they finally figured out that rifle never had any ammunition in it. Here, where the bus that picked up the POWs and heading back to camp, we got miles down the road and realized they were missing a POW. Picked him up, and here he was running down the road trying to catch up to the bus. Probably didn't want to have to walk all the way back to camp. He's probably worried he missed his supper. One POW said the food was so good that he gained 60 pounds while on the POW. If you were a POW overseas, you probably lost 60 pounds. Camp Janesville. This camp was located on the southwest side of Janesville. There was a 10-acre site, double barbed wire fence, even had 2 guard towers. Here, there was a truck taking 17 POWs to a work site. The truck was involved in a traffic accident, rolled over. 9 of those POWs were actually hospitalized. No Americans were. farm is that there were a lot of them. They would park them if it was closed, but truck them to the farm, drop them off. They'd probably stay there as a guard and might even join the POWs working. But if the farmer only needed a small number of POWs, they would just drive to the camp, pick up the POWs, take them to the farm, and then return them to the camp at the end of the day. In this story, there was a farmer that needed 3 POWs. He needs to get them to another farm for the afternoon. But he had his daughter drive these POWs to the other farm. Now, farm kids get started in the farm business at a very young age. The daughter who drove these 3 POWs to the other farm actually drove past the state patrol car, and she was 9 years old. What these stories tell you is that if they wanted to escape, they had plenty of opportunity to do so. If they wanted to assault civilians, again, they had opportunity to do so. Many civilians that were either assaulted or killed by a POW. Camp Jefferson. There's a wealthy banker who had a stately home on a farm, and he had POWs that would come and work. And he also had a maid and a dachshund by the name of Shotzi. And periodically, Shotzi would escape out the back door and run out where the POWs were working. Maid would go to the back door and yell, "Shotzi, Shotzi," and the POWs began to hoot and holler at her, and she didn't know why. And perhaps somebody should have told her that in German, Shotzi means sweetheart. Camp Lake Kisas. This is perhaps the most posh of the POW camps. This was at the Chandler Resort, luxury resort at that time. It had its own beach and dock and even men and women's changing room with showers, restaurant, and it even had a dance hall. And housed in this dance hall in bunk stack 4 high. They create quite a bit of damage to that dance floor. They would have the military police would go out with speakers telling the people to take shelter because they had POWs escape. They would then begin to hunt for these POWs. They'd find them 2 hours later, 2 of them walking down the county road with the local girls. It's also said that the owner's wife would raise chickens and the POWs would steal and eat these chickens. Damage to the dance floor. He will not renew his contract with the military in 1945. Camp Markesan. Here, this is kind of interesting. It was reported that the military would consider such affairs to be internal affairs. They would deal with it, and that this indeed was a Nazi that killed another. Canneries at this time said we have a bad batch of German POWs. These were the Nazis. The Nazis would either refuse to work, or they worked very slow, or in the means and equipment. If they determined indeed that they do have a Nazi, they would be sent back to one of 2 base camps, the Camp McCoy and Camp Sheridan, just outside of Chicago. And they would never be allowed to go and work again. They verify that is in the next year, 1945. Now they say we have a good batch of German POWs that are willing to work long hours along. Quite cooperative. That will actually travel through 41 states and 2,200 towns and villages, including Markesan. And they'll actually cut 7 holes in the side of the submarine. So for $1, you could look inside of that mini sub. And again, 3-day presentation, go into quite a bit more detail about that. In May of 1945, everything changes with POW camps and POWs. Why bother trying to escape? Why create any problem? The guards know they're going to be going home. Tight security. And many of these POWs will simply be considered or given the title of trustee. And they're allowed to walk into town, go to the bar, go to the stores, go to the theater. If you went there in late 1945, it was not unusual to see German prisoners. Camp Sheboygan, when looking for a site, they decided to use the abandoned county asylum, which was thought to be haunted, still considered to be haunted. But it was a nice facility. It was large, had showers, had kitchens, worked quite well. Biggest problem they had here was keeping the teenage girls out of here. Interesting story. There was a 13-year-old. He looks out the window and he sees two strange men walking up the driveway. There's no idea who they are. And there's a knock on the door. His dad goes and answers the door. And it turns out it's two POWs, one of them is his dad's brother. His parents had immigrated to the U.S. His brother was still in Germany fighting the war. They will spend some time visiting. They speak in German. He doesn't understand any of all of this. But again, he looks out the window and now he sees a camp guard and two MPs coming up the driveway. So his father tells his wife or his mother to get those POWs in the basement. There's a knock on the door, and the dad opens the door, and the guard said, have you seen two POWs? The dad said, no, I haven't seen anybody. And the guard's quite confused. He said, well, they were given permission to come and see you. So he then has his wife bring up two POWs, and they return to camp with the guard. Camp Sturgeon Bay. This is actually sites. The largest was at the fairgrounds in Sturgeon Bay. The other 6 would be at orchards scattered throughout the county. The POWs would either stay in tents or barracks, which would normally be occupied by immigrants that would be brought in to do the picking. And it is said that the German POWs saved the 1945 Door County cherry crop. The combination of those 7 sites will pick 508,020 pails of cherries, earning the government 101,604 pounds. Camp Waupun. I call this the most scandalous the stories. Well, I guess getting pregnant would be pretty scandalous as well. Here, there is a German POW who is acting as an interpreter, and he is sharing notes with an American woman who lives in a house just outside of the camp, and her husband is overseas fighting the war. The notes escalates into nightly visits, and the neighbors are kind of concerned. Report it to the police. The police investigate and realize that this is a POW, not a guard. He is sent back to Camp Sheridan, and he's given the most severe penalty you could give a POW at that time. 14 months of bread and water, followed by 16 months of hard labor. The American woman will plead to adultery and receive 1 year of probation. Times have changed. Here's Camp Billy Mitchell. You can see how large this camp was, and again, the security of this camp. POWs will operate the largest battery assembly line in the nation at the time, or an affiliate of railback batteries, making small batteries for radios and transmitters. They will receive a batch of POWs, and that night, 2 of them will go over the fence and they'll head into Milwaukee. They come across a beer hall, thinking, well, that'd be a good place to go and get beer. The surprise that even more surprised that most of them speak Polish. The police have committed mail fraud, and these two look suspicious. They're on inside out. So they arrest them, they do their investigation, and realize these are not the men they're looking for, they're escaped POWs. They will take them back to the camp, and the camp doesn't even know that they had escaped. But because of that, now they'll have to put a second fence around the camp. They'll now put guard towers at each corner of the camp, and those searchlights will stay on all night long. When the police leave, the POW if you tempted or you escaped a POW concentration camp in Germany, you would not be shot on sight. You would be taken back to the camp. All of the POWs or prisoners would be lined up. The drawings and paintings done by POW, and many citizens will buy those. They will have and they'll publish and print their own paper in their own language. Things were not bad at these POW camps. You would think you would find all kinds of photos of POW camp, but you don't. And the reason again for that is, remember, these stories were there. You don't find necessarily a whole lot of photos of the different POW camps. This is one from Camp Columbus, where the media was actually brought in to see what the conditions and treatment are. You can see them working at a bindery there on the left, marching to their truck and being loaded on the truck, and outside their barracks and washing their clothes on the concrete floor. There's some more. This is Door County, where they're arriving by train. They're doing their cooking, working in the fields. Even the guards are joining in. And again, a good example of the big letter PW on the front and back of their uniform. Arriving by train to go to Camp Green Lake. The middle one is Camp Baton, a tent encampment. Top right is POWs in front of a cannery in Appleton. Bottom left is a sketch of the camp at Hortonville. Those were all tents. There were no permanent buildings. Middle is Camp Lodi. And on the bottom left, you again see the tight security of the POW camps at Camp Fond du Lac. This is kind of an interesting story. John was a military guard at a POW camp, and he asked the German POW that he carved for him. His son was Terry Cross. Well, Terry Cross is now in Denver, and he contacted the Plymouth Historical Museum, and he thought that this boat should belong in the museum. That the president of the Historical Society was in Denver when he contacted him. He said, well, I'll take it back with me to the museum. And today it is in the Plymouth Historical. I'll just finish up here talking about perhaps the most famous German dialogue or POW camp. By POWs, it is the only German dialogue. Okay. Many of you have probably seen this on TV over many years. Like 13, but you probably know it as Hogan's Hero. The main characters are Colonel Clint, Sergeant Schultz, American Colonel Hinslow, and Sergeant Carter, British Corporal Newkirk. They ran from 1965 to 1971, filming 160 episodes. Only Colonel Klink and Colonel Hogan were in every one of those episodes. The four officers, German officer, Klink, Schultz, General Burkhalter, and Major Hochstetter were all Jewish. Schultz and Burkhalter actually escaped Nazi Germany. Frenchman Corporal LeBeau actually survived the concentration camp. If you ever watched Hogan's Heroes, still on TV today, you would often see General Burkhalter coming and arriving in this six-wheeled vehicle. This was a 1938 Mercedes-Benz, meant to be an off-road vehicle. You will find many photos and movies of Hitler standing in one of these in military parades. Forever manufactured from 1931 to 1938, and only 3 survived the war. This one is in Hogan's Heroes. Our question, the last question is, what happened to the POWs following the war? Many of them did not want to leave. They wanted to stay. As I mentioned, they had shelter, food, work. They had entertainment. The YMCA would provide them with instruments. They'd either form their own band or orchestra, or they would have a choir and they'd perform for the community and the POWs. Soccer. Well, you can see why they wanted to stay, but no German POW were allowed to stay. They will all be repatriated to their home country. Once they are repatriated, they could apply for a visa and to come back to the U.S. But in order to do so, they would have to have a sponsor. And the sponsor would have to guarantee that they would have a place to reside and a job to work. And many of them will apply for visas and they will return, or they will bring their families back to show them where they had served as POW. And to the farm families, they got to know where they worked. I want to share with you one story, wrap up here with this story about a POW who did just that. And his name is Kirk Peckman. Kirk Peckman was captured on November 6th of 1943, and he came to the U.S. as a POW. You can see him here in Hartford, and you can see here in the middle left and soccer team. He will work at a number of the POW camps in Wisconsin, and then he will be repatriated in 1946. When they're repatriated, they do not go directly to France, but they will go to Britain, and they are obligated to perform 2 years. He will say that service after he is repatriated much more difficult. After he does his 2 years of service, he returns to his home country. His town is destroyed. There is nothing. A farmer in Lodi that he knew and asked if he would sponsor him to come back. He and his wife will return to the U.S. He'll go to Lodi. He will work for that farmer for 9 months to pay off his obligation. Work as an engraver at a monument company. Now, I didn't know anything about this story until following the presentation of the story. And he said, that monument company was my father's company. Kirk Peckman will then buy that company from his father, and he will rename it the Peckman Monument Company. And that Peckman Monument Company is today, and it is being operated by his son and his grandson. I had the privilege of doing this presentation in Madison College, and unbeknownst to me, his son that presentation. And it's part of the story, and I said, verify everything that I said. Is it true? And he said, yeah, it's true. That is because of the treatment he received while a POW. And in honor of that treatment, he and his company, their business to honor U.S. military. And they have built many of the veteran monuments in the state. They did all that engraving and that list. Forrest, who said we wanted to build a veterans monument. We didn't know what we had to do, other than we knew we had to do a fundraiser. She said, I just randomly picked a memorial company in Madison to get more information, and it was Heckman. He said, when he answered, I said, and then we started a fundraiser, and she said, cut her off. He said, what do you need? When you need it? Last time I saw Kurt Beckman, he said, yeah, he said, we have a couple more stones to lay and that one will be done. That again is the dedication that they have because of the POW. His son Gary tells me that he would constantly say the best day of his life, the best day of his father's 1943. That is the day he was captured and became a day that starts his life's journey to the U.S. as a POW and being repatriated and then coming back and establishing the Peckman Memorial Company and then honoring U.S. veterans and law enforcement. I just thought it was a perfect way to end a presentation about POW. How one POW turned that into a lifelong business. Well, if you want to know more about the branch camps, I would suggest you get the book, Salac, Wisconsin. There's more there to learn and to read. And again, I will leave this up here. These are the 38 branch camps that we had, and you can again check and see if you may have lived in a community that had it. If you want my information, I'll leave this up here. You can take a photo and come back. I'll leave it there if you want to take a photo quick. I guess maybe I'm doing a little bit more publicity. An interview with PBS. I don't know when that's going to be. I know when I'm doing the interview, I don't know when it will be posted. Kind of interested to see what happens. So I want to thank you for your time and your attention. I hope you found it informative and educational, and I'd be glad to take any questions you might have regarding this presentation. Thanks. Anybody have any questions about them? You know, I get questions like the question was there one a POW camp in Sun Prairie? We mentioned 38, but they said there could have been as many as 40. Some of these may have just been, but there was in Sun Prairie, the POW worked at the Oconomowoc Canning. Yeah. Another question? Yeah. As we mentioned, every state had them. Now, another question that was often that I get asked is, did we have the POW camp because of our German heritage in Wisconsin? The answer is no. We had POW camps because we had work for them to do. So we had far more POW camps in Minnesota, maybe even more than Iowa. Although, again, many of those would have been farming and cannery. In 1931, Wisconsin had 171 canneries, all independently owned. And by the 1940s, they started buying them up and merging them into large companies with. Question?
You mentioned earlier that you have these other talks you get.
All over. I go all around the state.
How do you publicize?
How do I?
How do you publicize what you're doing?
I don't really. And I did 97 last year. I have 100 scheduled this year. Different presentations. So I think next 2 weeks I'm doing 3 in one day. So everyone's different.
Are they on YouTube or something?
No, you can go online. Let's say you wanted somebody to see this. You could go online and say Wisconsin POW Camp by Robert Black. And you'll find a link to the Oregon Library where this has been recorded. But
And
here's my calendar for April. What I'm listing here are only public places. I do a number of them at, and I don't list those because they primarily, but these would be all public places, libraries, senior center, and so forth. Yeah.
What do you need in terms for the city?
By citizens, there was a lot of hatred because of the fact that they had relatives injured or killed or received, and the treatment the POWs were receiving. A lot of civilians couldn't find work. They always had food. A lot of civilians struggled to get food. So there was a lot of contempt and hatred. And one of the concerns, the reason that much of this was censored was because the attempt to do something in terms of attacking and or cases, the citizens realized quite quickly that the POWs were why not? They never had to worry about a bomb falling on their head or somebody shooting at them. So camp was good, and the stay would indicate that they were treated quite nicely. We followed the Geneva Convention, unlike Germany, Russia, and now.
What you said about
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, American POWs in German camps were treated much better than a Russian POWs or even German citizens. That doesn't mean, remember, many of them were at a starvation point, but they weren't abused, they weren't gassed, they weren't shot, killed like German prisoners. All right, I'll stick around and answer any questions you might have. You had one more? I'm just curious, I know. What's it? Which senator? Yeah, the question, are there German POWs in Forest Hill? No. What is in Forest Hill are 140 Civil War soldiers. And you'll see that in the Camp Randall presentation. Yeah. There are no German POWs. Camp Randall was used as a Civil War POW camp during the Civil War. It was not used at all as a POW. Well, have a good night. You have questions?
you can also show the thing.
Yes. If you want to see Camp Randall or the crime lab, let's throw it on. We'll come back and do that one again.
You know, I've never had a speaker, but you could come to their house. I genuinely appreciate you. Well, sorry, I know that a lot of people just come with a heater. Yeah, yeah. So it's your feed. I appreciate it. Can I click your mic real quick? Thank you. You're gonna.
Waterloo. My babysitter's dad was a POW. And I thought he had stayed here, but he must have had to go home and come back.
Yeah.
But I thought he actually never left. Yeah, we were modernly here to start.
Yeah, if they want to hear it.
Yeah. That's it. All right, thank you so much. So you're able, thank you. We'll come and see it.
Sorry, you should. Oh, you have on camera? I took a picture of you. That's the email.
Thank you. That's good.
Like the one you, this one you do in the rain by. Yeah. Now, hard, senior center or something. Regulation. Type of thing. Well, and from my part, I'm doing it on 20th and 1. No, we're from. You sure would love to sit in on this. You want to see the right side one, here you go, over here. Where are you working? Okay. 5:30 is. You could speak, it's thank you.
Oops. End stream. End.